I am making this video to share and discuss my story and kind of my, narrative journey of becoming a terf as a 25-year-old straight man, which you might think sounds quite strange on the surface, but I think once I kind of tell my story and kind of narrate it, it will make sense to most people, at least most people who are also on the terf side of things. I think many people will find it quite relatable. A few months ago, I came across this video by, another person on YouTube, sharing, his peak trans story as a gay man. And I did relate a lot to this kind of the concepts in this video, and wanted to share my own and kind of get my thoughts off my chest and kind of, narrate my own journey of arriving here. This video is not really going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the arguments for and against the gender movement and, gender identity as like a philosophical concept. I don't really have time for that. It's more just going to be describing my personal experiences that contributed to me becoming a sex realist. And I'm going to try to start kind of from the beginning. I do have some notes that I am reading off of, but I think I'm more or less just going to speak off the top of my mind and then do it in a few different cuts for each different segment of kind of my story. So yeah, it's probably going to get quite long, this video, but maybe watch it on 1.5 or 2 times speed and do something else as you listen. So anyway, I'm just going to start from the beginning, and hopefully some people find this story interesting. So I'm just going to start from the very beginning and give some context on my personality that I think is kind of relevant to why I am kind of more inclined to not believe in gender ideology as an objective truth. So when I was a very young child, I stopped believing in things like the Santa Claus, legend and the Tooth Fairy when I was very young. I think as young as 4 or 5, I was already articulating why Santa Claus doesn't make sense to my parents. Like, I was asking questions such as, well, how is it possible that Santa can fly around the whole world in one night? There's not enough time. And I clearly did not believe in magic or superstition. So I was just breaking down all the reasons why Santa Claus was just impossible and didn't make sense. And as a young child, I remember going to elementary school, showing up to kindergarten around Christmas season, and I was aware that the other kids believed that Santa was real. And this was a problem because I would have to pretend or keep my mouth shut. And I think you can already start to see there's some parallels to believing and not believing in gender ideology already. And as I got a little bit older, perhaps around 12, 13, 14, kind of in my preteen and teenage years, my kind of natural skepticism evolved to becoming quite fascinated with religion. I actually attended a religious school when I was a little bit younger than that, for a few months. I believe it was a Catholic school. And I didn't have any particular problems with the school, but I just found that I didn't believe what they were saying about the Bible or scripture was objectively real. Like, I wasn't convinced that it actually objectively happened just because an ancient book said it happened and other people believed that it happened, right? And I didn't have any particular animosity towards people that believed it. I was just like, I don't really feel like it's real. And when I got my first computer, around the age of 12, 13, I started watching YouTube, and I became sort of fascinated with people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who were prominent kind of academic, philosophical kind of atheist characters, if you have not heard of them. And they would often have lectures and kind of debates with creationists, and they would debate the issue of evolution versus creationism. And I found this very interesting because I would listen to the creationists, and their arguments, to me, they made no sense. Like, how is the world possibly 5,000 years old? Like, that when there's all this evidence pointing towards that just not being possible. And how they believed that evolution didn't happen and we were all just put here how we were. And I was very compelled by the arguments that people like Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris and whoever else would put up, kind of debunking the creationist worldview. And at the time, I was I thought the like fundamentalist religion was quite dangerous for society. I mean, I still would largely agree with that. So I bring this up to just kind of demonstrate that from a young age and through my teenage years, I had this personality of being skeptical of believing things without evidence, and I found it very fascinating and compelling to witness people believe things without evidence and make quite extreme decisions in some cases based on having no evidence. And I enjoyed the logic of breaking down why their beliefs don't make sense. So this is just kind of an introduction to why I didn't swallow the pill of gender like so many of my peers did. So I went to high school from the years of 2013 to 2017 in Canada in a very progressive city. And despite this, during school, I was never once exposed to the concepts of gender, gender identity, transgenderism, or even sexuality wasn't discussed, if at all. There were no Pride Month, Pride Parade. There were no trans flags, no gay flags. There was no bulletin boards around the school. There were no clubs that I was aware of. There were no students that identified as trans. And of course, if there were gay and bi students, we just didn't talk about it. We just didn't notice. It was just everyone was treated the same as far as I could tell. It just wasn't part of our experience and wasn't part of our culture. And I didn't go to high school that long ago, which I think is a stark contrast to nowadays, where the schools are plastered in the Progress Pride flag. They have Pride Month, they have celebrations, they have decorations, they have advertisements, it's embedded within the curriculum, they learn about it in classes, etc., right? In fact, even when I went to high school for my grade 9 year, I would wear this rainbow toque to school every single day because I didn't want to brush my hair, and I just had this rainbow toque lying around our house and I just liked it. So I wore it to school every single day. And it had nothing to do with the gay pride flag. And I don't think anyone thought of it that way. It was just rainbow colors. It was just colors at the time. And I never once wore it for that reason. But looking back, like, of course, nowadays, if you wear something rainbow, it's not just colors. It's like a political statement. It means you're either part of that community or you're some sort of ally, right? And of course, nowadays, I would never wear anything rainbow because it signals politics to people that I don't have, right? I mean, I wish I could still wear some rainbow colors. Why not? But of course, nowadays it's very different. So my first actual exposure to gender ideology in person was during my first year of university, and I was on the varsity swim team. And as part of our initiation, we were required to take this workshop delivered by some activists. I'm not sure if they were students or with a separate organization. But anyways, these activists were there to sort of educate us on how not to sexually assault each other at parties. It was quite condescending. Essentially, they were sort of telling us, don't roof each other, don't sleep with people who are way too drunk and can't consent, and all this kind of stuff. It was like Me Too on steroids. And of course, I was quite annoyed with the whole concept because there's people here who are only a few years older than all of us, kind of educating us as if we are sort of these primitive beings with no moral compass, and we must be educated by the progressive activists on how to behave. But anyways, the exposure to gender ideology was, of course, they asked us all for our pronouns, and this was the first time I had ever been asked to give my pronouns. I had never thought about it up until then. And it wasn't just they were asking, it was a demand. Like, we were compelled to give our pronouns during this workshop. And I found that quite strange. But of course, I complied. And the vibe in the classroom was, it was quite like chilling almost. Like, everyone was very uncomfortable, that no one was eager to share their pronouns, to say the least. It was quite strange. And at the time, I was thinking to myself, like, if I was trans, or if someone here was trans, then doing this whole pronoun ritual thing, it really just draws more attention to the topic and to them. And my impression at the time was that trans people just wanted to kind of go about their lives and blend into society and not bring up the fact that they're trans, right? I thought they just wanted to be treated like everyone else. And I kind of realized that this whole ritual wasn't treating them like everyone else. It was treating them like something different, right? Because it is essentially outing them as having these different pronouns to everyone else. So I guess I was already becoming skeptical of the demands of the gender people, for the reason that I thought it was actually bad for people who were trans at the time. Of course, now I have a much deeper criticism of it, but at the time I was like, well, this doesn't seem to be helpful for anyone, including people who are trans. But anyway, so that was my first exposure to gender ideology. We can move on a few years later, because I didn't think much about it for the next couple years. But of course, I could tell that the culture was shifting over those few years, and I could see that the mentions and the discussions of gender and gender identities and the whole alphabet soup community, and the pride flag and the pride month and the pride parades it was becoming very prominent. You couldn't really ignore that the culture was shifting in a way that this stuff was very front and center all the time. And well, you fast forward to the Leah/Will Thomas swimming situation. And of course, like I mentioned, I was a competitive swimmer. So I followed this news quite closely, and I was quite perplexed by the whole thing. So I watched an interview. It was from one of the teammates of, I think her name is Ryuki George or something. I think she's the Hungarian swimmer. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyways, it was one of the swimmers who she wanted to get into the finals to be a finalist in the NCAA championships. And of course, she was bumped out one spot because Will Thomas took the spot. And of course, he went on to, get on the podium in many events. And I just felt so bad for this person. And I think I was just watching this video on YouTube, and I think I just started tearing up at the time, even though, of course, I have no personal connection to this story. But as a swimmer myself, I could just personally relate to how emotional and how bad it feels to, miss a finals cut or miss a podium spot or miss a best time. And it feels really bad to not achieve what you want to achieve in a competition. And that's even different than this situation where there's something happening out of your control that you're not consenting to, that is preventing you from getting in that final and getting on that podium, right? So I just felt so bad for the women in that swim meet, and I just couldn't understand how this policy was permitted, because I immediately at the time recognized that this policy was not only going against all the consent of the female athletes, it wasn't benefiting any of them. It was, in fact, it was harming every single female athlete because it destroyed the integrity of their category for the benefit of this one male athlete who identified as female. So I could immediately see the logic start to break down as how are you going to put the so-called needs, or the desires, better put, the desires of this one person over the integrity, functionality, objectivity of the entire female category for all women, right? And I immediately recognized this as just a flawed way of thinking. So that was the first mainstream incident that kind of sent me down the path of starting to try to learn more about why we're here and what is happening with gender in our society. So I think the first book that I decided to read was the one by Deborah So. I think it's called The End of Gender. And this was during the time of the Will Thomas debacle. So I started learning a little bit more about the concepts of gender identity, what is sex, what is gender, what does transgender mean, where did this come from? And I was far more compelled by what gender critical people had to say than what the trans activists had to say. It was, again, reminding me of the religious argument of the creationists versus the evolutionary biologists, where the gender activists, they say things without any concrete evidence. It's all concept, it's all based in language, it's all linguistic, it's not material. Whereas the people who are gender critical are just simply speaking in facts, like, humans are male and female, you can't change it, gender is sort of this undefinable inner sense of yourself that could be based on feelings or stereotypes. And like when you break down the logic like that, I was just really confused on how the gender movement, if you will, was really picking up so much momentum. And at the time, I was aware, living in a progressive Canadian city as a young person, I was aware that this stuff was becoming very front and center, impossible to ignore. And the expectation was that you would be an ally and that you would be a believer. And that if you weren't an ally and a believer, you were to be shunned and excommunicated from the tribe. If you were critical of gender, you were immediately labeled as a bad person. And I could recognize this as being a big problem for just society as a whole. So that is also what sort of made me fascinated by this topic, was the kind of thought control being imposed. Because I recognize that believing in female-only sports was not bigoted whatsoever. In fact, I think it's the opposite of bigoted. And to realize that the current culture I'm living in now labels me as a bigot because I simply don't agree with the concept of certain males entering the women's sports category. It made no sense to me, and it was deeply concerning that I could see people around me were thinking this way. So we can fast forward a year or two after the Will Thomas debacle to kind of my next much more personal sort of interaction with a gender ideology situation in my real life. And at this point, my beliefs on gender are not very strong. I'm definitely not a believer. I never was a full believer, but I would probably be willing to use people's pronouns at this point. I would have probably been able to be convinced that this thing called gender dysphoria was like an actual legitimate medical concept that required so-called gender treatment. Obviously, I don't believe those things now, but at the time I was less informed on gender. However, the next event in my life that contributed to my peaking would, work to change that, you would say. So this event happened with a friend group of mine, and this was probably my closest friend group throughout much of my life, friends that I met in school. And one of the guys, as you might have guessed, began identifying as a trans woman. And of course, my whole friend group was immediately affirming and supportive and didn't question anything, and didn't treat it as a big deal at all, which I thought was very strange, because obviously I have questions and skepticism, and at the time I obviously wanted the best for my friend, and I was very concerned about the medicalization and the functionality of adopting this new identity. And I think, unlike my friends in that group, I really was just also concerned about the social factors and the cultural factors that would lead him to adopt a way of thinking about himself. So, for context, my friend was, I guess, kind of like a trouble. He had depression and anxiety, and he had dropped out of high school and had to finish high school online, which took him years longer than us, and we were the same age. He was, quite an internet dweller, like most of us were, and he didn't appear to have any successful romantic relationships that I could tell. He didn't exercise. He was just quite socially reclusive, and we were kind of sort of the nerdy social outcasts, kind of that type of friend group. And I could tell he was spending all of his time, on internet, on Reddit, on Discord, playing video games, TikTok, Instagram, just kind of immersed in the internet. And there were some things that we had known about our friend that were obviously connected to adopting the trans identity. So, this was a very close friend group, and we shared all sorts of things with each other. And it was this friend of ours shared that he was into femboy and femboy culture, and creating, femboy content and like sexually lewd femboy content. And if you are watching this and you don't understand what femboy is, it's not trans. It's essentially just cross-dressing, typically kind of young men, often gay. I mean, you don't have to be. It's essentially just cross-dressing men who are sexualizing themselves. It's often kind of with more of like a kind of anime aesthetic, this kind of thing, very sort of fantasy, and it's very sexual in nature. It's fetishistic in nature. But femboys don't identify as girls or women or female. They still retain, their male identity. But nowadays, it's obviously a gateway drug to just going on full trans mode and adopting a cross-sex identity. So we were aware that our friend had, was interested in this kind of fetish thing. And at the time, I always thought it was gross and weird, but like I wasn't going to argue with him about it and be like, he obviously wasn't hurting anyone. But then fast forward a few months and he adopts the she, her pronouns and changes his name. Or, I mean, like, I don't think he legally changes his name at the time, but he requests that we call him a new name and new pronouns. And as this was happening, I don't know, it was my friend group just started immediately affirming, and I had some questions. I also had some questions beyond like the sexual fetishistic motivations of, doing this. I was kind of suspicious that there was some sort of like internalized homophobia going on as well, because he had one relationship and we had met his boyfriend, but of course his boyfriend was from the internet. It was not like a actual in real life connection. Although, I mean, they did meet in person and we met his boyfriend, but he wouldn't call his boyfriend because it was a they them, right? And he came from one of these Discord communities, I believe. So I was wondering if like my friend was not only maybe had these sexual motivations to cross-dress, but was also possibly gay, and there was internalized homophobia playing a role in the cross-sex identity. So there's just all these many factors that I think can lead someone to adopting a trans identity. And I really saw this in my friend, from the depression, the internet addiction, the pornification, the sexualization, the fetishization, the possibly internalized homophobia, the culture, the affirming culture, the rumination, spending all your time on TikToks and Discords and Reddits and Twitter and all these places where you can surround yourself with trans content and gender content and like people that reinforce these beliefs onto you. And then of course the whole medical aspect, like none of my other friends in this group were like questioning his decision to like go on estrogen, which obviously has many medical implications. And at the time I asked him about it, and he seemed to think, well, my health will be exactly the same as what he called cis women, right? Which is obviously ridiculous. But like once you're in that sort of just delusional way of thinking, there's not really any arguing. So I had a decision to make with this friend group. Like I did continue to hang out with them for a while in private, but I realized if I were to actually share my opinions and kind of try and discuss gender, or let alone if I were to call him by his actual name, or call him a him, right? There would be a massive conflict and a fight, and I would be considered the villain and the enemy and the one in the wrong. So I didn't really want to have this conflict that was inevitable. And I also didn't want to lie. And I realized that if I was to, continue to be friends with this friend group, like if we were to go out into public, like if we were at the bar and I was with this friend group, I mean, I would find it embarrassing because of course my friend, who's a large man, would, be using like the women's washroom, and like I wouldn't want to be associated with that. It's just because it goes against my like views and my values, right? Yeah, I guess I had the decision to make. Either I could have a conflict with this friend group, or I could just slowly kind of part ways, and that's what I did. I slowly parted ways. So to this day, that friend group doesn't necessarily know that I disagree with gender, and I think that our friend is self-harming and it's not helpful. And I still observe this friend group kind of from a distance, just in the remote chance that he detransitions and becomes disillusioned with gender. But so far, that has not happened. And I can tell like their beliefs in gender are very strong. I think they are the type of genderists that actually believe that trans women are female. So I think they combine sex and gender, because of course within gender, ideologists, there's a variety of beliefs. Some people acknowledge that sex and gender identity are different, but there's also genderists that believe that sex is kind of this spectrum continuum thing that can change, or that you can change your sex, or that your sex is always changed, or your sex is just an identity. So I actually do think that this friend group is currently at the point where they think our friend is a female, which is very far gone. So I just don't think I would get along with them really, which is quite disappointing, because I was very good friends with them for many years and I have lots of fond memories. But yeah, that was probably the most personal event in my life that contributed to my peaking, was just kind of watching the self-harm of my friend and the affirmation from the friend group of the self-harm, which I think is sort of very disappointing. Because, I wish, like, if I was self-harming myself, I would wish that my friends would, tell me the things that I might not want to hear, but I need to hear, to, help me. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels between, taking the steroid hormones for the gender reasons and taking the steroid hormones for body dysmorphia reasons, such as like many young men who go to the gym and use steroids or SARMs or other performance enhancing drugs, right? This is a huge problem going on currently in our society, is that people who go to the gym, they want to look better and they're uncomfortable with their body and they take steroids. And it's a very similar kind of concept to gender, because the concept of gender, right, is that you are uncomfortable with your body and you want it to look different, so you take steroids. And I don't see them as logically very different on that element. Obviously, gender comes with far more ideological beliefs than the people who want, bigger muscles and to be leaner. But I'm just, where I'm going with this is, like, for example, let's say like I started taking steroids because I was, had body dysmorphia. I would hope that my friends would try to push back on me and try to encourage me to, get off of them and be healthier and be accepting of my body. Because I view it as quite a similar concept. But of course, like in this analogy, they would be encouraging me to continue taking the steroids and take more steroids, and this is good, and this is fixing you, and this is helping you, when of course it's not. It's just self-harm. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of my most personal connection to the gender, the story about my friend. So we can move on to the next kind of thing that happened in my life regarding gender. So after the situation with my friend who started identifying as a woman, it didn't take much longer for me to have another personal ongoing encounter with a person who identifies as trans. And this time it was I guess you would say the opposite scenario, of a female who identifies as a man. And this happened where I was working at the time. I was working at a rec center, and I was working a shift during a swim that was to accommodate for people with disabilities. So during the swim, there was a patron who would come with an electric-powered wheelchair onto the pool deck, and this person would need to be like hoisted in our lift system between the pools, right? Because she couldn't walk. Although at the time, I genuinely thought she was a he, because this is how she introduced herself, with a male name and male pronouns. And because she was, sitting in a wheelchair and she was quite overweight, it obscured her figure, and she had facial hair. She was wearing tinted goggles, which she would never take off. She would exit the change room wearing these tinted goggles. So I thought it was actually a male. Like, I thought this was a man. Because it's hard to tell, and females, when they take testosterone and they're overweight and they're sitting down and they're covered, it can actually be kind of hard to tell. So it was my job every single week to help this person between the pools. And she was quite demanding of the lifeguards. Like, she would enter the hot tub for like 30 seconds and then complain that it's too hot and want to go in another pool and then go in another pool. So I was constantly getting her in and out of this lift system, which was, it's quite a contraption and it's quite time consuming and difficult to do. And I was the only lifeguard that even knew how to do it, and I was like the best at it. So it was always me. So I was always having these prolonged conversations and interactions with this person by doing the lift on them. Because it would take a few minutes every time, and it would happen multiple times throughout the time that she was at the pool. So after a few sessions, she began opening up to me, and that's when I learned that she was trans. And she started talking to me about her trans identity and how she's on testosterone and how she plans to get all these surgeries, the hysterectomy, the phalloplasty, the double mastectomy. And of course, like, I need to remain professional because this is my job. I can't like start going off and going on a turf rant about how she shouldn't do it and stuff. So I was just kind of nodding along, like, oh, okay, like just kind of listening essentially and observing. And immediately I could recognize that this was an absolute tragedy. So this person, she told me about how she's autistic, and I could already tell from interacting with this person for hours every single week, that her level of cognitive ability it appeared quite low. Like when I was interacting with her with the lift, she didn't really understand or remember how the process worked, like which clip went where, which strap hooked up to, which connecting spot. So I would have to be really in charge of the whole process of maneuvering her body and getting her into the harness system to lift her out of the pools. And you would think, someone who's a bit more with it, they would start to learn the routine a little bit better and kind of understand what I am doing as the staff member. But she was just totally out of it most of the time and didn't really, I could just tell her critical thinking skills were not very developed. And her entire personality revolved around being disabled and she had a victim mindset. So, for example, she would enter the large pool, but she would claim that she's unable to swim. So she would stay and just hold onto the wall and just kind of float there near the stairs, like holding onto the wall. And I would ask her like, oh, like, are you able to swim? Like, do you know how to swim? And she said, no, I just can't swim. And she had no reason for not being able to swim, and I could tell that she probably could swim. So I went out of my way to have another lifeguard cover my post. I got into the pool with her several times, and I would assess her swimming, and then I would encourage her to swim. And it turns out she was perfectly able of swimming laps of the pool, but she just, in the beginning, before I did that, she would just refuse because she was kind of ruminating in this victim mindset that she is unable to do things that are physical, right? So a few weeks later, and she's talking to me about an appointment she has about her wheelchair. And of course, she's a wheelchair user, and I've never seen her stand. Like, I am assuming she is paralyzed or something. And she starts talking to me about her diagnosis. And she is starting to mention things like, oh, like, I might finally find out why I can't walk. And I start like kind of asking like, oh, what do you mean by that? And it turns out that she is not paralyzed. She has no physical medical disability. She's using the wheelchair for psychological reasons, and this is what her doctors told her. And she told me this is what her doctors told her. And she didn't seem to admit it, but I immediately recognized that is obviously what's happening. Because she explained that she has no physical problem. There's no known physical problem, and she has not been in the wheelchair her whole life. It's a recent addition. So I could immediately tell that her use of the wheelchair is most likely and essentially an accessory to her identity as a victim. And this is just such a complicated situation where you have an autistic, low cognitive ability, socially dysfunctional a young woman who has never had a relationship before, has apparently has no friends, as she told me. Her whole personality revolves around her pronouns. Just an aside about that, there was a time I was doing a first aid on an elderly woman, and she calls me over and says, just so you know, in case you're talking about me, my pronouns are he, him, right? So she called me away from a first aid situation, a medical emergency, to tell me about her pronouns, when of course the situation has nothing to do with her, right? So it's just sort of this weird selfish need to always have your identity catered to, and this sort of victim mindset. And I recognized all of this, that her trans identity was not doing her any favors with her life, because obviously, for one, she's on testosterone and she is planning on having her body medically, surgically transformed with extreme complication rates. Like, because of her autistic black and white thinking mindset, she is sort of all or nothing, right? So she is getting the full thing, not just the mastectomy. She's getting the hysterectomy. The phalloplasty is coming down the line, right? She's just on a very long wait list to get it, because the demand is so high, which is insane. And I mean, that surgery is an absolute horror show. Like, if you should just Google pictures about it, if you're interested, Google the images and the complications and what can go wrong, and stories from detransitioners about it. It is a terrifying surgery that completely ruins your whole urinary system, your whole genital area. It is a devastating surgery that can disable you further. And she's already self-disabled. She's already in a wheelchair. She's already overweight. She's already physically weak. So I could tell that this pathway of just further medical destruction to this confused, autistic, lonely woman was an absolute medical scandal. And I was just absolutely distraught that our healthcare system would do this to someone, and that the doctors would not put two and two together, that this person is literally using a wheelchair for psychological attention, and her whole personality is revolving around pronouns, and yet you're going to cut her body into pieces and remove her breasts, remove her uterus, sew her vagina shut, remove flesh from her forearm and roll it into a sausage tube and sew it above her groin, only for it to probably become necrotic and have a vast amount of, complications. And of course, she told me all this. She's never had like a romantic relationship before. Like, I'm presuming she's obviously, a virgin, probably never kissed anyone. And here she is, and she's going to be completely sexually disabled for the rest of her life. Like, you're not having functional sex with your flesh sausage that is above your sewn shut vagina. It's not a functioning human body. So anyway, I could go on and just keep ranting about that, but that was another situation that I was exposed to in my real life that I just found absolutely devastating. That our healthcare system would just do this to someone's body and not explore options, just like talking about why this person has been led to this way of thinking and like what this means. And I just really wish there was a non-medicalized approach that our healthcare system would take. But of course, it's actually not affirming has been made illegal by our government here in Canada under Bill C4. If you are to convince anyone that they may be better off not identifying as trans, it is considered conversion therapy, and it's a crime. You can be fined or you can go to prison, right? So if any of her doctors say, hang on a minute, like maybe let's put the brakes on for a moment and talk about this, that's considered a crime in Canada, right? So it's just absolutely appalling. And like, once I had this personal encounter, I think that one, even more than my friend, I think this really pushed me over the edge of losing favor for the whole gender movement. Like, I really left a bad taste in my mouth of what is actually happening to people and what is being done in the name of gender. My next collision with gender ideology happened at my school, where I study exercise science. So you can probably see where this is going. And of course, as many people know, universities these days have been completely captured by identity politics, and they are very progressive left in their politics. So as part of my degree, we are mandated to take what essentially is a sociology class. And this is a 400 level class. And the topics are on social issues as they relate to sport. So, of course, the gender issue is one of the units in the class. And, of course, the premise is not such that, oh, there's this gender thing happening to women's sports, and what could we do as exercise scientists to educate the public on sex differences and why women deserve their own sports? Of course, that's not the premise. The premise of the class is how can we be kind and inclusive to the men who want to enter the women's sports. So I could see this was coming down the pipeline, and I had made the decision that if this topic were to come up uncritically in class, that I would offer the counter arguments. So I felt I ought to prepare myself. So this is really when I started going full terf mode and started consuming a lot more gender critical content and really trying to educate myself so that I could put up a coherent, articulate rebuttal. Because, of course, if you don't know much about this topic, you can intuitively understand that, men shouldn't be in women's sports. But when the activists start arguing with you about all these things and using very obfuscating, confusing language and shifting the goalposts and citing bogus research, it can be quite difficult if you're not prepared for that. So I wanted to prepare myself. And of course, the time came in this class where we had a guest lecturer who was a trans activist who indoctrinated us with a whole bunch of lies. Like, of course, there's no difference between men and women, and it doesn't matter, and trans women are women, and sex is a spectrum, and Caster Semenya is a female, and sports categories are just a social construct of Western colonialism and all this insane bullshit. And at the time I pushed back, and the class everyone was terrified, and it was just you could hear a pin drop in the classroom, and I had a brief argument with the lecturer and then left and moved on. And later in that semester, I ended up writing a letter to the faculty and the dean of the school, explaining why there is a problem within the class with, there being a bias towards one side of a controversial issue. And we're being taught things that are objectively untrue, like sex is a spectrum, like Caster Semenya is a female and not a male who has 46XY5 art. So the result of me writing this letter to the faculty was, I met with the dean of the school, explained my position. Of course, the professor of the class had to hear about all this. But on the way, I did make some allies with, our biology professor, who is, took the sex realist position. But, this debacle was very stressful for me, obviously, because I made a lot of enemies coming out as a sex realist and a non-gender believer. And I guess part of the reason that what was happening at my school contributed so much to my peaking was, not necessarily just the lies that were being taught in an academic institution that's supposed to be scientific and objective. It's the fact that the environment and the culture makes disagreeing with those lies socially, social suicide, essentially. It is there's extreme social pressures to go along with saying 2 + 2 = 5. And if you offer any disagreement, any pushback, you are essentially labeled as a bigot. Now, the teacher of the class was not outright calling us bigots, right? But given the broader context of the culture as a whole, that's the reality of the situation that we're in Canada and many Western nations, right? So of course, all my peers are terrified to to say anything, even if they do agree with like the position that I put forward. And I had students who I had never met before come to me in secret and shake my hand and thank me for saying something, because they're too terrified to speak, or they're not like, equipped with the information on how to push back against these problems. And of course, like, there are many students that are indeed brainwashed, that are in my program, that are gender believers, right? But I find the strength of their gender beliefs is very shallow. They don't actually know much about the topic. They just essentially know that they have to agree with it in order to be socially accepted in a very progressive Canadian city in the current day and age, right? So I fundamentally don't think the people that are the gender pushers and the gender believers within my fellow students, I don't really think they are true believers deep down. They're very superficial believers, but regardless, it did make my life very socially difficult at school, and I accepted this, but I became essentially a pariah for doing this. At this point in my peaking journey, I would say I was quite open about sharing my views, and I was not really hiding or pretending anymore, because at this point, I was quite knowledgeable about sex and gender and all these topics. So I wasn't afraid to defend myself or push back when the topic would come up. And of course, this would in the future get me into a whole lot more trouble than what happened at my school. And my next collision with gender ideology being forced upon me was at a different workplace. It was a different rec center to the one that I told the story about earlier. And this rec center just happened to be a little bit more, I guess, politically progressive, you would say. They were very much into all forms of identity politics, intersectionality, what we would just call essentially being woke and virtue signaling. And this rec center, of course, came out with a policy memo and a set of directives for the lifeguard staff, which I was one of, to follow regarding how we were to handle situations in the changing rooms regarding gender self-ID. And of course, the policy in Canada as a whole is that gender self-ID is the law, it's the status quo. So of course, this rec center is following self-ID, but they were not just following self-ID quietly like most rec centers. They were promoting it and celebrating it and advertising it and demanding a certain way of acting if issues arose, right? So the demands on the lifeguard staff were that we were to educate, and if educating didn't work, we were to evict anyone who complained that there was someone in the wrong change room, right? So if a man goes in the women's change room and let's say a mother with her daughter complains to us staff, we are to educate her that it is the man's right. And then if she says, well, that's stupid, we are to kick her out of the facility. That is the policy memo. And the policy memo, it actually went beyond gender self-ID, and it made the change rooms completely redundant. So the policy actually stated that anyone can go in whichever change room they personally feel safest in, right? So it didn't actually even say that patrons may go in whichever change room they identify with. It was about which change room they felt safest in. So you could still technically, based on this policy, identify yourself as a man, and you could go in the women's change room and you just claim, I have safer feelings in here. And of course, this policy was so insane, and the demands placed on the lifeguard staff, I just felt so ridiculously offensive that we were being demanded to evict patrons who were non-gender believers. And there's just so many problems that I wanted to point out with this, that I ended up writing a very large essay to the management of this recreation organization, explaining the problems with this policy. And what really got me in trouble in this situation is that I took a screenshot of the policy directive that was sent to lifeguard staff on how we were supposed to behave. And I sent this screenshot in a private message to several large Twitter accounts. and they shared it. Like people like April Hutchinson and Megan Murphy and some other accounts shared it. And I mean, it went, for the context of, the turf Twitter, it got some attention. Like it didn't go viral or anything, but, the posts were definitely getting traction. So my employer found out about this, and I was summoned to the highest levels of HR, and they were giving me kind of veiled legal threats about how I need to stay silent and not speak about this issue. And I could tell that if I were to remain employed there, either I would be fired or they would actually potentially pursue legal action against me. I could just get the sense they were extremely hostile. They did not want to hear any feedback that I had for them. They did not address any of the points that I explained to them would happen in my letter to them. It was this meeting with the management and the HR was completely about how I had, done this misconduct by sharing a screenshot of a policy. But of course, the policy is a matter of public interest because the policy is directly affecting the public. So, of course, I personally did not feel that I did anything unethical. It's not like I was leaking anyone's name or email. It was just a policy memo of how people are supposed to behave. So yeah, I really had no regrets on what I did, but of course this caused all sorts of problems in my life because people found out that this was me, and I lost several friends, like longtime friends, who just, when they found out this is what I thought, and and like that I had done this and that I had lost my job because I ended up resigning before they fired me, and that I was willing to like defend myself and, essentially like die on this hill intellectually. Yeah, I was called all sorts of things like, like an intolerable, hateful bigot, fascist, far right, conspiracy theorist, this like sort of thing from people that, used to be my friend. And I mean, of course, that's not helpful interaction. And I mean, of course, it further solidified my position that these ideas in society are so detrimental and people's brains have essentially been hijacked to lose all of their critical thinking abilities and abilities to, absorb or digest why people don't believe that gender self-ID is a good thing. So that was probably the most, significant event in my gender peaking journey. Because I mean, at the end of the day, I did lose a job, and I did become even far more of a social pariah than I ever was from just what I did at school. And I did lose many friends from this one. And, things to this day are still quite awkward for me because of that situation. But I don't really regret anything I did. At the end of the day, I did meet a whole lot of people because of it. Like I've met with people like Megan Murphy and April Hutchinson and Mia Hughes and like all these interesting turf type people who I'm very aligned with, and I'm very grateful that they support like what I did in my own small way of pushing back against gender. So it's been very helpful to have acquaintances like that who are supportive, given that I have lost so many friends and had such like a socially difficult time for just simply, not believing 2 + 2 = 5. So yeah, that was probably my most significant event, was losing my job because of change room self-ID. And just one more thing that I forgot to mention about that whole debacle with my former employer was that several weeks after I had written them my letter and met with them and then resigned, they had an incident in their change rooms at one of their facilities. And there was a man who went into the women's showers and, made all the women in the change room uncomfortable. And a mother who was with her daughter and her daughter's friend complained to the staff, and she was told to essentially be more inclusive and that anyone can go in any change room. And all the things that I explained to them in my letter that would happen happened exactly as I said they would to this mother. Like, she was blamed. the man's behavior was excused, and they told her about their inclusive change from policy and blah, blah, blah. And so everything I predicted happened, and this ended up becoming a Redux Mag story, and it was shared on Twitter by J.K. Rowling. So that did feel a little bit vindicating, at least. And I guess I feel like I now have some small personal connection to this story that went somewhat viral on Twitter and that J.K. Rowling shared. So, I mean, yeah, terrible that it happened, but I'm kind of in a way glad that it happened, because it did feel like, I was sort of proved right, that this thing that I said would happen happened just weeks after I quit that job. At this point in the video, I think I have addressed all the significant events that have happened in the past few years to me regarding interacting with gender ideology. There are, of course, like a few more events that I could touch on, but this video has gotten quite long, and I want to wrap it up soon. So the last kind of thing I want to expand on a little bit is just like how, I've had interpersonal relationships in my life affected by this. And of course, like I've mentioned, I've lost many friends, and I've received quite a lot of hostility and aggression for simply having these, views. And it's been quite, I guess, stressful and disappointing to lose friends. But of course, I don't want to be friends with someone who thinks I'm a evil bigot, or in their words, a far right conspiracy theorist, like all these absurd things that are obviously not true. And I guess beyond friendships that I've lost, in terms of dating and meeting women, that's also been, made a lot more difficult because of my views. Because I do, like I mentioned, live in a very kind of progressive Canadian city. Most people have been indeed socially conditioned to, be gender allies or gender believers, or, whatever you want to call it. And people have been socially trained to be, adversarial to anyone who is not a believer or is critical of any aspect of gender ideology. And of course, the vast majority of people have pronouns in their bios and think of themselves as allies. So I feel like my, potential dating pool of women in their 20s has probably been reduced by 80 to 90%. So for example, I just have like kind of a, interesting story about trying to date a girl a few years ago. So, I was in the talking stage with this, one girl who seemed like a quite attractive, nice young woman. And I could see on her social media story that she had changed her pronouns, and immediately I kind of thought to myself, like, okay, well, darn it, like, it's not going to work with this one, obviously. But I could also see that she was in the hospital, and she had got a double mastectomy for being non-binary. And I think the caption of her post was something like, "No more booba." So obviously kind of using this sort of like immature, euphemistic, kind of joking meme language about having her breasts, healthy breasts, amputated because she now uses they, them pronouns. So that's just kind of the thing that you encounter when trying to date women in their 20s in the woke Canadian area, is that you never know if the person you're trying to date might change their pronouns and have their body parts amputated before you even go on a first date with them. So it's just, quite a time that we live in. I have had a relationship with a girl that was, I would say, like terf light. Like, she was not a gender believer and she was accepting of my views, but perhaps did not agree with how, interested I was in this topic. But I mean, I was appreciative of, at least being, tolerant and accepting of my views at the time. But of course, I mean, I am single now, and it just definitely made things difficult trying to, go on dates when 80 to 90% of women are pronoun people and gender believers. But I mean, anyways, beyond, losing friends and having all this hostility, towards me, and, having problems, dating, it's also definitely made some family relationships very difficult. I have family members that won't really speak to me at this point because of my views, which is obviously, a difficult situation. But at the end of the day, like, I mean, kind of my policy is that, people who genuinely believe that I am sort of immoral or a bigot or hateful or evil, I don't really have the, the capacity to, interact with you because of like, I mean, I guess all the vitriol that I've experienced over the past couple of years. It's been very stressful. So it's really just more conducive for me to live a functional life, to surround myself with like the few friends that do agree with me, or at least, accept, that I, think this way. And I think this just like goes to speak to like the broader problem of why this topic is important and why I care is, it's not just that like, I recognize all these things that are being done in the name of gender that are harmful, like, like putting male criminals in, women's prisons, and putting males in women's sports, and putting, males in women's changing areas, and, giving children steroids, or cutting teenage girls' breasts off for no reason other than, gender beliefs, and all like the medical deconstruction of people's sexual reproductive anatomy, and all like the medical harms, and the policing of language, and like all this undermining of material, like all, like, I know I could go on and on and on about all the harms of the gender movement. But it's not just that there's harms, right? It's that there is such a large contingent of society and all of the authorities with power, such as, the medical system, the education system, the police, the banks, the corporations, the, big tech, the media, and of course the government is all a proponent of the gender movement, and they're all invested in it, and they're all funding it. And if you are not a believer, you are punished. Like, for example, in Canada, you can be taken to a human rights tribunal if you use the wrong pronouns, right? You can get fined for using the wrong pronouns. And with Bill C-63, which is our hate crime law coming down potentially soon, you could be sent to prison for being gender critical, right? Because it would be considered a hate incident or a hate crime, right? So you have all these problems in society. You are punished for believing that 2 + 2 = 4. So I find the whole thing rather Orwellian. And, a few months ago, like I reread 1984, and there's just so many parallels to what's been happening with language and the plot of that book, right? And I think that's sort of part of the reason why this topic is so important, is that, if you can make people lose their ability to recognize fundamental truths about reality, you can really manipulate them in all sorts of ways. So, I think most people would agree that the most fundamental aspect of, human existence and human evolution is that, there are males and there are females, and that's how we reproduce as a species. That's how humanity has come this far, is that's just how it is. And that you cannot change that, right? And that is a fundamental, concrete, material concept that is very important to human life and existence on this planet. And if you are able to make people lose their belief in reality and start to say things like sex is not a concrete concept, or that it's a social construct, or that it can change, or that a gender identity is more important than people's actual sex, you can really essentially make them believe anything without evidence, which I think is very dangerous. If you can, make them believe that men can be women, that belief is really, when you think about it objectively, that belief is more insane than believing the world is flat. Because, of course, to prove the world is round, you need to do experiments. You need to use math, and you need to have, higher level critical thinking skills. Or, of course, you need to defer to evidence collected by other humans. You can't really prove the Earth is flat easily by yourself. But, of course, you don't need to defer to evidence or conduct scientific experiments to realize that all humans are male or female, and that's important. You can just observe that with your own eyes. So, I think the flat earthers are essentially more intelligent than the gender believers in a way, which is, quite insane. The fact that the gender believers have changed, governments and laws and policies to cater to their belief, and the whole medical industry, they've changed the medical industry to cater to their belief and demands, right? And I guess that's part of why this topic is so important. But anyway, I mean, in this video, I don't really want to spend, any more time or hours going into the specific arguments about the philosophy of gender identity, or like why all these, implications about it are, wrong. Like we could spend hours doing that. I just kind of wanted this video to be a bit of a narrative about my own story, about things that have happened in my life that have led me to becoming, a terf ally or gender critical or sex realist or whatever. I mean, I do kind of prefer the term sex realist. That's kind of what I like to use. But anyway, I think I can wrap it up here. I hope someone has found this video at least relatable or entertaining or compelling. I'm not sure if anyone will end up watching this, but I kind of just wanted to get this off my chest and just kind of tell my story, given that, recently in my life, I've had a few more interpersonal relationships break down, and it just kind of helps me just tell my story, and just, it kind of helps me remain sane, remind myself that, no, I'm not crazy. I've had these experiences, and this is why I think what I think, and nothing that I think is insane or bigoted or conspiratorial or far right or fascist or, whatnot. So, making this video has definitely helped me collect my thoughts a little bit. Yeah, so if you enjoyed, please subscribe. I might make more videos in the future about, kind of just whatever I'm feeling like. I've only made one video before this, but I do kind of enjoy just like kind of talking and getting thoughts, off my mind and, out there. So anyway, yeah, that was all. Please leave any feedback you have in the comments and I'll read them and interact. But yeah, anyway, have a good New Year, everyone. And yeah, talk to you later.